Have you ever considered how deep the history of the internet truly goes? How many people were involved before and now? How many stories and events have been buried in the depths of the World Wide Web? How many more are yet to come? Out of the many sagas we've seen unfold online, the Ballad of Christian Chandler is the stuff of legends. I'm not going to bother introducing you to everybody's favorite spastic punching bag, but rather I intend to introduce you to his arch-nemesis, a man so influential that he had a lasting impact on not only Chris, but the community surrounding him and even future trolls. This is the story of an orange-faced hole resizer that shook up the life of the most gullible person on the internet. Clyde Cash, a man of many monikers and aliases, is undoubtedly the most prolific troll to enter Chris's life. He played a major part in creating an almost theatrical element to Chris's misadventures, posing as a direct maniacal villain to our artistic protagonist, stopping at seemingly almost nothing to get a rise out of the star of the Chandler family. Not only would he bully Chris for all of the obvious reasons we all know, but he also gave Chris insight into what unfortunate events were on their way. Most of what Clyde warned Chris about has come true in some shape or form, as demonstrated by how much of a catastrophe Chris's life has become in recent years. Despite the obvious bullying, there was a clear attempt from Clyde to show Chris that his behavior was wrong. It just happened to be coupled with some prodding. As far as things on the internet go, he was actually being pretty kind to him because people online don't usually have good intentions. The entirety of the Clyde Cash saga is often regarded as the most significant of the many sagas that have occurred in Chris's life. This is mainly due to how many stories were produced or tied to Clyde, alongside how Chris would respond to the negative stimuli. It was never good. Chris saw Clyde as the most treacherous of all of his detractors. He wanted Clyde to fucking die, which is the normal reaction to encountering someone you don't like on the internet. He'd routinely wish bodily harm upon him. This includes demonstrating his all-caps rage strength by murdering a clown plush doll on camera. When violence failed to sway Clyde's opinion, Chris then tried and failed miserably to blackmail him, and then he just painted his face a shade of orangish brown to impersonate him. Not a good look for him, gotta admit. Clyde was brought into our world on July 4th, 1976. Before campaigning against the tortured autistic virgin, Clyde spent his youth as a generous soul who would adopt children and raise them when adoption rates were low. He was also a famous musician that somehow had absolutely no records online. He made music to honor the death of his brother, Ryan. Ryan totally existed and wasn't just part of Clyde's larger story to mess with Chris. You can trust me on that one. Turns out he anheroed upon hearing that Chris was at war with Encyclopedia Dramatica, and in protest Chris would no longer be releasing any comics until the page was taken down, thus preventing the release of Sonichu 7. This deeply affected Ryan and pushed him over the edge. He couldn't stomach the harsh realities of our world without the solace he got from the ongoing Sonichu franchise. Before ending his life, Ryan left a note that was reasonable, heartfelt, and emotional. It reads as follows. Dear family and friends, this is my final message to you. I am going to kill myself after my hero, Christian Weston Chandler, let me down. Sonichu was my hero, and without any more comics, I will never be able to aspire to be just like him. I hate Christian for deciding to not make any more comics and being lazy. All he does is play his stupid video game and not care about anything but himself. He's such a jerk. Goodbye forever. I hope to see you in hell, Chris. Ryan Cash. The passing of Ryan was a tremendous blow to Clyde, understandably devastated that his totally real brother roped over an autistic guy's internet comic. This might have actually emotionally destroyed the Clyde character and set forth the events of his interactions with Christian Chandler. When Chris learns about the unfortunate end to Ryan's life, he treated it rather inappropriately. Let's see what Chris said in a video titled Quick Update 12/28/2008.
And for Ryan Cash and his family, I feel for you, and I'm sorry, but best thing you could do for Ryan and yourselves, just to move on. Try to be happy in the future. That's what Ryan would want for y'all and the family. Gee, so much power. That's a lot worse than when that child locked himself in the room after seeing Optimus Prime die in the original movie.
Clyde was not pleased upon hearing Chris's response to the tragic news. Clyde saw this as his own call to arms, a sign that he was being pulled into the trenches of internet warfare. Much like everything else online, this was serious and shit was about to get fucking real. Clyde had some ideas, and little did he know how far he was going to get in Christery. In order to take on the most naive person to ever exist, Clyde had to come to terms with his change in purpose and identity. No longer was he this badass rich dude with orange skin and a big penis, but now he was an angry man powered by his fervorous hatred of the mayor of Quickville. This was more important to Clyde than anything else in his life. His disdain for Chris had completely taken over him, transforming him into a vicious golem of sorts. Clyde's foray into the art of bullying morons was rather unique, as instead of just calling Chris a poopy head, Clyde convinced him that he had assaulted Chris's lover, Panda Halo. This was revealed in an IRC chat, where she had confessed that Clyde had gotten her pregnant. Clyde proceeded to call her a liar, because he's a gentleman and wears condoms when he does such terrible things. Chris was shocked at first, but seemed to desire everything being solved quietly. He wanted to forgive Clyde for sticking his meat stick into Panda by force, and then suggested that Panda should get an abortion. Chris didn't grasp the gravity of the virtual tragedy because it really didn't affect him. Somehow, Clyde's alleged snuggle struggle with Panda Halo made her become a sex addict, because that's totally normal. Chris also didn't question the validity of their statements. In fact, this might have been beneficial for Chris because as long as he didn't mind another pickle being in his vicinity, Panda was actually open to the prospect of having a three-way with Clyde and Chris. Chris, however, was still more interested in his own little projects. As such, Panda gave Chris a hefty ultimatum. He either needed to make contact with Nintendo in order to make Sonichu a real intellectual property so they could have enough money to live together, wherein she would also control Z, Clyde's unborn child, or she would instead move in with Clyde in his big mansion, allowing Clyde to raise his baby with her. Chris, unsurprisingly, didn't do a goddamn thing, and Panda went to Clyde. After all of this, Chris just moved on to the next virtual hole. I guess none of it really mattered to him all that much, huh? Later on in the story, a website was created for the vast female fanbase of Sonichu titled Sonichu Girls. This website was masterminded by Clyde in order to lure Chris in and do funny things with him. This website's existence was integral so they could keep a closer eye on him, be directly in his ear, and inevitably catfish him. When the site was revealed to be a trolling op, it was later rolled into a board for Chris's actual fanbase, the Trolls. This site was also used by the Miscreants, which was a cabal of trolls who orbited Chris from 2009 up until about 2011, disbanding around the time when Bob Chandler passed away. Clyde is said to have been the original leader of this group, and under Clyde's leadership, the group claimed responsibility for many of the unpleasant events that unfolded in Chris's life, many of their claims being impossible, but Chris took their word for it. Their ultimate goal was to prevent Chris from ever losing his virginity. Thanks to a prostitute, Chris was able to thwart their endeavors some years later. Moving along, if you followed Chris's story for a minimum of 30 or so minutes, you'll likely at least have an entry-level understanding of who Julie was. Clyde was a major player in the Julie saga, but you should probably already know that. He and a 13-year-old boy going by the name of Blue Spike created a fictional girlfriend persona for Chris named Julie. Blue Spike was playing the roles of both Julie and Max Milvana, who were both siblings from the fictional country of Mulvania. The goal of the operation was simple. Use both characters to pull at Chris's heartstrings in order to get funny results. Chris being Chris, this didn't take much effort. During this whole ordeal, Clyde played the role of his usual dastardly self, supposedly stalking Julie and breaking into the Mumble chat so he could ridicule Chris through voice calls. This was easily done through Mumble as Blue Spike had set up a Mumble server where Chris could talk to his legion of rabid fans who cling on to his every word. Once Clyde got into the server, he would make many demands and claims, particularly that he was going to hurt Julie if Chris didn't admit to being gay. Chris responded pretty well to this, coming out as a Gabian, and when Clyde wasn't pleased, he followed up with another video where he admits that he's fully homosexual. So brave.
Simply put, and I'm willing to say this in sound mind and body, I am a Gabian. Yep. You heard me. I am a gay. A male lesbian. Anyway, so, to get to the point, fine. I'm gay. I'm gay. I'm gay. I said it.
This saga does get a bit crazier, you know, like Chris porking an inflatable toy on camera kinda crazy, but I don't want to spend too long elaborating on Chris's pickle being thrusted into a rubber lever. Clyde and Blue Spike both had to bust their asses to get such a video from Chris, and by God, they got quite the special custom order, but somehow this would only lead to bigger events. Later on in the saga, Max somehow managed to kidnap Julie, his sister. And if that wasn't confusing enough, Clyde got involved shortly after, wherein he threatened to send Julie to China if Chris didn't save her in Cleveland, Ohio. Confused, so was everyone else, but Chris looked past the unorthodox story and followed through with it, traveling all the way to Cleveland in an 800+ mile trip. The address that Chris was given unfortunately didn't lead to the whereabouts of a fictional girlfriend, but instead a rundown property owned by an elderly woman. After this debacle, Chris's PSN account had been hijacked. Turns out Chris had once passed along his login credentials when he was speaking to Julie, and Blue Spike, playing Max, summoned Chris into a Mumble chat to bargain. Clyde and others stood by listening to this event unfold. Max gave Chris an ultimatum. He could either have Julie or his PlayStation Network account. This proved to be quite the tricky decision. Chris did pick Julie, but admittedly still tried to haggle a bit to get his account back. You can't fault a guy for trying, right? Max told Chris no, and later forced him to cut up his medallion and jam it up his asshole. While this did happen, we are very fortunate in the fact that there is no recorded footage of it. Max then left and got Julie, where she revealed that she and her brother were just characters played by a 13-year-old boy. Quite the disgusting plan to say the least, but Clyde jumped in after this finished and told Chris that he wasn't getting shit. Even he seemed repulsed by what had just happened. This caused Blue Spike to be kicked out of the Miscreants for good reason. After everything had transpired, Chris decided that maybe it was a good idea if he took a vacation from the internet. For once, somehow, Chris had a bright idea. Clyde didn't take kindly to Chris detaching himself from the teat of the web, and promptly deployed his most powerful weapon, the man in the pickle suit. We'll just call him Mips for short. Anyway, Mips made contact with Robert Simmons V, who was previously an anti-troll, and used him to infiltrate Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church. Robert, having previously befriended Chris online, approached Chris and picked his brain for a short bit while Mips blended into the crowd and watched. Mips was also involved in a later major event, the Emily date. Chris met with Emily, a troll appearing as a potential sweetheart at Charlottesville Fashion Square. Once the two were walking away from the food court, Mips swung by and swooped Emily off her feet, taking her to the movies to undoubtedly resize her orifices, leaving Chris a virgin with rage yet again. Clyde claimed responsibility for the orchestration of everything and attempted to make it up to him by sending a bunch of escorts to the Chandler residence. Needless to say, it didn't exactly go over too well. This would all be too much for Clyde, and on the 22nd of May 2009, Clyde faked his own death via sucking a shotgun. When he returned a week later, it was revealed that Clyde made two purchases that totaled $15.98 after he had broken into the PSN account from before. It also wouldn't be long after this until Chris's PSN account was hacked yet again. Clyde just always had to find a way to hold Chris's habits over his head. Sometime after the events of the Liquid Saga kicked off, Chris believed that he had acquired the real name of Clyde, being Greg Mays, an attempt to call him out so they could duke it out in a one-on-one fistfight. This prompted Chris to upload a series of videos where he showed off his musculature and physical prowess, such as attempting to do 51 bicep curls with two 10-pound packages of canned lemonade. However, Chris believed them to be 50 pounds. This was primarily to convince Casey to hug Chris's penis with her lady hole and to strike as much fear as possible into Clyde.
Estimated weight? I'd say over 50 pounds of thing. So now, what's this? Alright? 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 45, 51, and 51! Ah! What a workout. I'm strong.
Chris would continue to use Clyde as his primary scapegoat for the next few years, believing him to be behind everything that went wrong in his life. While this is obviously not possible, it is funny to think that Chris never truly outgrew the childlike mindset of having a grandiose enemy. Since the alias Greg Mays was brought up, maybe it's time we look at some of the aliases that Clyde adopted over the years. Clyde's trolling efforts were multi-stage, planned-out operations that allowed him to interact with Chris from a variety of different angles, utilizing state-of-the-art oddest annoyance techniques that he learned from his top-secret CIA buddies. Many conflicts that involved Clyde would usually involve at least one of his other aliases, with Chris not being aware of who was actually who. Vivian G is a prime example of this, as she was a character created before the debut of Clyde, but she remains a common recurring character in the greater Quick story. It's also worth noting that all of these personas I'm about to list all died with Clyde's departure. However, Unfunny Nobodies tried filling the roles of these characters and were never anywhere near as successful or convincing as the true and honest Clyde Cash. Overall, Clyde's effective use of various identities is yet another reason why he is the true final boss of the Quick trolls. Greg Mays, for example, was one of Clyde's characters that was supposed to be a web designer that worked for Nintendo. Greg's purpose was to be part of a large-scale operation to hack into Sonichu.net, under the guise that the takeover would be an overhaul to the site itself in order to promote Sonichu being officially added to Animal Crossing. Greg received the login credentials for Chris's tripod account, logging in so he could make adjustments to the site and add a new system, whatever exactly that system was. He logged into the account and proceeded to lock Chris out of it. His demands were simple. He wanted Chris to make a video where he proclaimed that he was gay, or have Chris make a video where he explained how straight he was. If at least one demand was met, Chris would regain control of the website. Chris responded to this by posting a measly 7-second video defending his alleged heterosexuality, but Greg wanted something a bit juicier, so Chris made a longer video that gave us one of the best clips in Christory.
I, Chris and Chandler, am straight. Don't you forget it. Boobies. Vaginas. Gorgeous.
Clyde would later outright tell Chris that he was behind the Greg persona and not Jason Kendrick Howell. But Chris being Chris, he instead believed that it was indeed Jason who deceived him with the false identity. Perhaps because of his own confusion, this ultimately led to Chris somehow believing that Greg Mays was the actual identity of Clyde. What an unexpected turn of events! Despite all of this, Chris still believed that he was in direct contact with Nintendo staff. The video game production industry just sounds so tricky, doesn't it? Moving along, another identity assumed by Clyde was Shigeru Miyamoto, who is a major player at Nintendo. He's known for franchises such as Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Donkey Kong, and more. On August 15, 2008, Chris tried to use his hulking fanbase to persuade Sega and Nintendo to come together and create an official Sonichu video game. He received a letter after attempting to use this previously in 2005, which was just your standard issue rejection letter from a big corporation. Miyamoto entered the Quickverse shortly after this campaign began, emailing Quick about potential ventures for a Sonichu video game. Miyamoto force-fed Chris some hard truths, like pursuing Sonichu would likely lead to a copyright infringement lawsuit from hell, and that Chris was focused way too much on his own problems rather than the adventures of his fictional electric hedgehog Pokemon. Miyamoto, alongside the involvement of Reggie, went on for a bit longer until February 10, 2009. Chris received postage from Mike Chandler from Nintendo of America, stating that Chris had absolutely no correspondence with Mr. Miyamoto, being sure to include that Miyamoto speaks very little English to begin with. Another noteworthy pseudonym for Clyde was Brian Bash. Brian was an active troll, member of the Miscreants, and a close personal friend of Clyde. Despite being present for only a small number of events, he's actually tied to a handful of particularly noteworthy ones. He was a major player in the Bob Walks In incident. On Saturday, February 14, 2009, Valentine's Day, Chris was in the kitchen pulling his pickle while having a sweaty conversation with Julie through a voice chat, while Chris was busy trying to extract navy from his balls. The Miscreants were hard at work trying to stop Chris from being able to achieve climax from a casual round of phone sex. Their idea was yet another simple and effective one. Get Bob to head upstairs and confront Chris about something while his son was busy masturbating. It took several attempts, but Brian was able to get a hold of Bob and convince him that Chris uploaded a video where he stated that he planned to end Hero because of how mean the internet was. This worked quite well, as Bob walked in while Chris was mid-fap and cut down the internet. Brian's involvement didn't stop there, as this alias was tied to the hookers incident as well. Upon returning home from his failed date with Emily, Chris was probably feeling like he was never going to get to experience the beauty of lovemaking. Brian had an idea to solve Chris's little problem. Best part is, this was yet another brilliantly simple plan. He was going to send some ladies of the night over to Casa de Chandler to show Little C the ways of the woman. The penis polishing posse showed up, ready to give Chris a bit of the old hand twist tuggin', and Chris immediately resorted to crying. His parents, who were understandably upset by the whole situation, called the cops on the prostitutes. Shortly after this happened, Chris embarked on two very important calls, one with Emily and another with Clyde.
Hello?
Hey Chris, me. It's Clyde. Seemed a little hasty at the end there. I just wanted to talk to you.
Who is this?
It's Clyde. I want to say hi to Emily. She's still here. Anyway, I'm just wondering, like, I was trying to help you with your aversion problem, and I sent over some fine ladies over to your house. How does that work out for you?
So you were the one that sent them over, huh? Well, for your information, my family was very uncomfortable with them being sent over, and they reported them to the police, and they got turned in, and yeah, we did not appreciate that.
Chris, you claim to be a virgin with rage all the time. I'm trying to help you, man.
Yeah, well, sending over prostitutes is not exactly a way of helping somebody find true love.
Sex is not true love, Chris.
Yeah, are you still there, Clyde?
Yeah?
Yeah, keep your nose out of our business, Clyde.
Look, I worry for your family and everybody, okay? I'm trying to look out for the best of you, Chris. There are much more evil men in this world.
I don't know who you think you are.
Hello?
I said, I don't know who you think you are.
Chris, your voice
But I'm
changed.
telling you to cease bothering us, okay?
Chris, your voice
Otherwise,
changed.
your butt's going to be in trouble. Your butt's going to be in trouble.
Is your
So just
refrigerator running?
Back off.
Oh,
Don't call us anymore. Goodbye.
no, honey.
Clyde called Chris shortly after the call with Emily had ended, as he had previously interjected right before the call came to a close. Chris couldn't really retort to anything Clyde was saying, and instead of just ending the call there, he got Barbara to fight his battles for him. The trolls weren't swayed. Continuing onward, yet another classic alias for Clyde was Mao Bamboo Ling. Mao was a good friend of Alec Benson Leary, and he just so happened to be the webmaster for the Astropedia, which was a parody of Chris's own Wikipedia. Mao purchased ad space on the Wikipedia from Jack Thaddeus for $2,000. This was after the pro-gay ads were displayed briefly on the site. Mao's ads were used to promote the Astropedia and later make fun of Chris, with Mao eventually deciding to plaster more gay ads on the site, just like Jack did before. Chris, of course, responded by cursing Mao. Chris's hatred of Mao would appear in Sonichu number 10, where Mao and other members of the Astropedia 4 were put on trial for the alleged murder of Simone LaRosechu. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. Mao's execution was especially excruciating, as Chris used his fantastical psychic powers to crack Mao's bones until his heart exploded. Pretty fucking metal, really. On March 17, 2010, Chris said the gamer word in a video, which pissed off Jack Thaddeus, which eventually led to him cutting all of the funding for the Wikipedia. This somehow allowed Mao, or rather Clyde, to become an admin, wherein he and the Astropedia 4 began tearing the website apart for shits and giggles. Eventually, they made it so nobody could even edit the Wikipedia. However, a few short days later, the site was restored back to its original state. Mao did later manage to break into the site yet again and opened up editing permissions for everyone, which caused plenty of havoc to be unleashed onto the site. Mao then proceeded to hand the site over to Alec Benson Leary and Vivian G. Speaking of Vivian, like I stated before, she was also yet again one of Clyde's personas. The Vivian character was supposed to be Clyde's cousin, who would begin contacting Chris by claiming to be the actual creator of Sonichu, which made Chris very angry. Vivian would later transition into a supposed sympathetic troll, as demonstrated by her suggestion to Chris that he should destroy his prized Sonichu medallion. But she wouldn't just stop there, as she created a variety of Sonichu media, such as the Sonichu audiobooks. Vivian was shaping up to be quite the powerful force in Chris's life. After Clyde's alleged untimely death, Vivian took the reins of the Miscreants, leading with an iron fist. Just like the person whose shoes she was filling, Vivian received plenty of death threats from Chris. One worth noting is when somebody left a sign up on Chris's front lawn on Halloween in 2008. He held onto the sign for several months, eventually showing it on video on September 6, 2009. Chris had assumed Vivian was the one who planted the sign, and as such decided to record himself destroying it in a particularly barbaric manner. The sign's destruction was actually influenced by Emily, as she and a friend had planted the sign and just wanted a bit of closure. When taking the time to sit down, count your fingers, calculate the risks, and measure the outcome, Clyde apparently had a lot of free time on his hands. Unlike his target, Clyde was able to spend his free time devising new schemes to get a rise out of the mayor of Quickville. Time after time, over and over, Clyde would manage to dupe Chris yet again. This would usually go over pretty easy, but eventually Chris had enough of the abuse. To put it simply, Chris saw Clyde as one major pain in the ass. When Clyde poked Chris a little too hard with a stick, Chris pushed back by sending death threats. Though again, this wasn't all that unique of a response considering Chris had sent similar veiled threats to Vivian, but it is what it is. Chris did openly state that he wanted Clyde to die, which, to be fair, is a totally reasonable way to feel about somebody you only know from the internet. Chris once elaborated on strangling Clyde, punching his lights out, and doing things that involved his ass and throat. All of these are things that Chris would not be able to achieve, not just because Clyde is likely more physically fit and mentally equipped than Chris, but because Chris is lazy and this was all an internet slap fight. The primary victim of Chris's man-baby meltdowns was a little clown doll that he would regularly abuse as a means to release his pent-up sexual frustrations. This poor little funny face-painted fucker would receive beatings on a regular basis, all on camera, especially when Chris decided to tape a photo of what he believed to be Clyde to the doll. The red-nosed comedian ultimately died at the hands of Christian after it was brutally maimed by him, wherein he ripped the tiny plush hat off of its head. He murdered a fucking clown. I guess death really was the punchline for Bozo. When Clyde returned after a brief absence, Chris puffed out his supple man titties and stated that he would eventually confront Clyde in a physical altercation, alongside proposing the idea that Clyde is weaker than water, whatever the fuck that actually means. He demonstrated this hypothetical scuffle in a video where he fought the air and somehow still lost.
But anyway, you want to see real muscles? Check these out. Da-da-da-dun. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-dun. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Boy, hello, Christian.
Hello?
What's the matter? You don't know me?
No, should I?
It's me, Clyde Cash.
Oh. What the hell do you want, you son of a bitch?
Oh, I just came by to tell you how much of a son of a bitch, lazy, yes, bigoted, treacherous rat you are. Oh, and how about that time I raped your sweet Australian panda bear? You son of a bitch!
Come on, get up, you son of a bitch.
Finish him.
This is for Sarah Cassandra McKenzie, you bastard.
Fatality.
Chris put in many hours in his mission to uncover the identity of Clyde Cash in hopes of scaring him off via the means of doxing and bullying, much in the same way he was targeted. He even considered getting law enforcement involved because kicking the autistic is serious business. Chris actually believes the image used as Clyde's avatar was a real image of the person who played Clyde, unaware that this was an image of Lee Hottie. Regardless, Chris used this image to represent Clyde in a variety of ways, such as affixing it to the previously mentioned battered clown doll. A former troll contacted Chris as a means to turn against the PVCC, and confirmed that the image of Lee Hottie Chris believed to be Clyde was not actually him. Something tells me it didn't really click with him. Chris later believed he had acquired the actual identity of Clyde yet again, as he claimed that Mr. Cash was a child who was currently enrolled in elementary school in Frankfort, Kentucky. Even though he was briefly convinced that Clyde was in fact a kid, he would still encourage his viewers to contact the police so they could deal with him, instead of just taking up vigilante justice. Not that I'm saying it would have worked here. This identity that he believed that he had in his possession obviously was not Clyde. In October 2008, Chris obtained more alleged information about the supposed identity of his arch-nemesis. He had acquired an image of a man who he genuinely thought was our orange hero engaging in a particularly gay act with an individual in a Spider-Man costume, which technically makes it less gay, but pretty gay nonetheless. Spider-Man removes at least 5 points from any calculated scale of homosexuality. Chris attempted to use this image to blackmail Clyde into backing off by sharing snipped segments of the full image. If Clyde didn't meet Chris's demands, he would release the image bit by bit, using the negotiation tactics of a kidnapper. Christian eventually hammered down on his attempts to push Mr. Cash back by photoshopping the gay Spider-Man image in place of the Twin Towers. What the hell this was actually supposed to accomplish has somehow been lost in translation. Chris did try to sit down and have a dialogue with Clyde in hopes of meeting somewhere in the middle to potentially appease both parties. Chris stated in Mailbag 5, "I would say the parts where I communicate with him, similar to a father-son conversation. You may, as long as you make a written reference to me as Sonichu's original creator with a statement like, Sonichu and all related material was originally created by Christian Weston Chandler. I would maintain a pleasant conversation with hopes of it not turning into an abusive conflict. I would not hit back unless he hit me first." Despite trying to broker a deal with Clyde, which obviously fell apart because negotiating with online terrorists is a waste of time, Chris went back to the name-calling. Ironically, even though Chris looks like a frumpy mess, he would never hesitate to make harsh comments about Clyde's alleged appearance, such as the color of Clyde's face, after smashing his own face into a plate of canned spaghetti.
Hey, at least my head's not fucking orange. Like a certain cashy type person I know.
For obvious reasons, Clyde has appeared in Christian's magnum opus, his series of shoddily thrown together comics. Despite being one of, if not the most consistent and pervasive troll in Chris's life, Clyde actually had a shockingly minor presence in the comics. Clyde was represented by Clyde, a bald villain that worked under Mary Lee Walsh. Chris's interpretation's appearance is quite different from the presentation of Lee Hottie that we all know and love, sporting a sparkling bald head, because the character was created prior to Chris seeing the photograph of Lee that he'd later believed to be the true and honest appearance of Clyde. Alongside his beautiful, shining bald head was a fucking awesome purple cape, which definitely made all the bitches flock to his penis. He also just has a jetpack for whatever reason. Quite fitting for Clyde to break all of the rules and have all the fun gadgets that Chris and Sonichu don't have. Despite my extensive research, I have seen absolutely no evidence for the real Clyde Cash having ever owned a jetpack, and to be honest, that makes me pretty sad. Chris strangely did not retcon Clyde's appearance in the comics after seeing Lee Hottie. This includes when Chris later drew the image of himself and Clyde setting aside their grievances, thus making peace. Clyde was first seen in Quick music video Holding Out for a Hero, which featured snippets of Sonichu Special 1. Clyde's character overall is not as properly fleshed out as some of the other major players in the comic. What we do know is that Clyde is presumably rich and lives in a mansion. He keeps that thing on him, which can either be a slander ray or a pickle gun, whichever he feels best suits the situation at hand. In fact, he actually used the pickle gun in a fight in the same comic in which he appeared, wherein he died around the same time as the 4-cent garbage building was collapsing. Jason Kendrick Howell left Clyde and Jack Thaddeus behind because they were both supposedly gay, and as such the now forced couple held hands and waited for their inevitable demise. Chris made his fictional characters suggest that Clyde was just as bad as Adolf Hitler, simply because he was an internet troll. Clyde and Jack saw no other options, opting to jump out of the 66+6 story elevator shaft, painting the ground upon impact. This death was ultimately retconned by the aforementioned Quick x Clyde peace image. Only in recent years has Clyde stopped being a villain. Overall, I'd say Clyde's impact on Chris's story, minus his minuscule presence in the comics, is easily the most noteworthy when compared to the other trolls in the legion of autism we know as the internet. Chris was never the same person after interacting with Clyde, being duped by various trolling ops and ultimately losing to the orange-faced fiend. While Clyde may have set out to aid Chris by informing him of his poor decisions, he created some of the most entertaining content to be consumed online, even if it was in pretty poor taste. Clyde has left a major mark on the vast and expansive history of the internet. Not many online trolls were or ever will be quite as prolific. We may not know the true identity of Clyde, but we do know what he left behind, a series of sagas that Christorians will be dissecting and enjoying for years to come. If you're to take away anything from this video, try looking at everything in the same way you would a zoo. It's just a semi-professional amateur troll finding the right ways to get a rise out of somebody who's a little too naive and self-centered to solve their own problems. It's a story as old as time itself. Chris was inevitably going to get relentlessly bullied. At least Clyde had the means to make it interesting. But that's going to be it for today's video. If you like what I do, leave a comment, rate, and subscribe. If you want to support me in a more personal way, you can check out the Patreon link and the Teespring link in the description. I've got more content coming down the pipeline. But until then, I'll see you degenerates next time.